The rain had been falling since afternoon, turning the streets of Brookhaven into narrow rivers that shimmered under the streetlights. It was the kind of night that made people hurry home, lock their doors, and stay close to the warmth of their families. But for Daniel Mercer, that night would mark the beginning of the longest, hardest chapter of his life. Daniel was a high school teacher, the kind who stayed late after class to help struggling students or fixed broken chairs instead of waiting for the janitor. Everyone in town knew him. He coached the debate club, volunteered at the animal shelter, and helped organize the school's annual charity drive. He wasn't rich, but he had a good life, a modest home, a loyal dog named Max, and quiet evenings filled with books and soft music. That night, though, everything changed. It started with a knock on his door around 10:30. Daniel had just finished grading papers and was about to make some tea. When he opened the door, 2 police officers stood on his porch, rain dripping from their jackets. Their faces were serious, and the flashing red and blue lights from the car outside painted the front of his house like a warning. "Mr. Mercer," one of them said, "we have a warrant for your arrest." Daniel blinked, confused. "My arrest? For what?" "For the theft of school property and embezzlement of funds," the officer replied flatly. Daniel thought it had to be a mistake. He even laughed for a second, thinking maybe someone was playing a prank. But when the officer took out a pair of handcuffs, the reality sank in. His hands went cold. "There must be some misunderstanding," Daniel said, his voice shaking. "I didn't steal anything." "You can explain that downtown," the officer said. They read him his rights as they led him out into the rain. The neighbor's curtains shifted. Someone's porch light came on. By the time the car pulled away, the whole street seemed to know something terrible had happened. At the station, the questions came fast. Where was he last night? Did he have keys to the school office? Why had money from the charity fund ended up in his account that morning? Daniel answered each question honestly, but every word seemed to dig him deeper. He couldn't understand how any of it was possible. He had helped run that charity drive. He remembered locking the donation box himself after counting the money with the principal. Now the police were saying that someone had broken into the school the night before, opened the safe, and taken nearly $15,000. When they showed him the evidence, Daniel's heart sank. There was security footage from a street camera showing his car parked near the school around midnight. His fingerprints were on the safe handle, and somehow his bank account had a fresh deposit for the exact amount stolen. "I didn't do this," he kept saying. "There has to be an explanation." But no one seemed to believe him. By morning, news of the arrest had spread through Brookhaven. The local paper printed a short article, "Beloved teacher accused of charity theft." Parents whispered about it in the grocery store. Students shared rumors online. Some said he'd been gambling. Others claimed he was trying to pay off secret debts. When Daniel's sister Lily came to see him, her face was pale. "Danny," she said softly through the glass partition, "tell me this isn't true." "It's not," he said, his voice low but steady. "You know me, Lily. I'd never do something like this." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "Then we'll prove it." Daniel was released on bail 2 days later. By then, his life was already unraveling. The school suspended him pending investigation. Some of his neighbors wouldn't look him in the eye. The people who used to greet him warmly now crossed the street when they saw him coming. At home, the silence was heavy. Max lay by his feet as if sensing his master's pain. Every time Daniel looked at the stack of papers he hadn't finished grading, a wave of sadness hit him. He loved teaching. He loved those kids. And now, it might all be gone because of something he didn't do. His lawyer, Rachel Linwood, was a sharp woman in her 30s with kind eyes and a calm voice. She had taken his case after hearing his story from Lily. When they first met, Daniel could barely speak from exhaustion. "Mr. Mercer," Rachel said, setting down her folder, "I've gone over the police report. The evidence looks strong, but that doesn't mean it's solid. We'll find the truth." Daniel nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. "Everyone already thinks I'm guilty." "Let them think what they want," she said gently. "Our job is to prove otherwise." The next few days were a blur of meetings, paperwork, and sleepless nights. Rachel visited the school to talk to the principal, Mr. Harlan, a man who had once praised Daniel as one of his best teachers. Now his tone was cautious and cold. "This has been difficult for all of us," Mr. Harlan said. "We trusted Daniel. But the evidence is, well, you've seen it. Rachel asked to review the security footage and inspect the safe. Everything seemed ordinary except for one thing. The lock on the safe looked newer than it should have been, as if it had been replaced recently. Daniel didn't remember anyone mentioning that. "Who else has access to this room?" Rachel asked. "Just staff," Mr. Harlan replied. "Mostly Daniel and the janitor, Eli Turner. He has keys for maintenance purposes." Rachel made a note of that name. Meanwhile, Daniel tried to stay hopeful, but each passing day made it harder. His mailbox filled with letters, some from former students expressing disbelief, others from people demanding he return the money meant for sick children. One anonymous note simply said, "Shame on you." He stopped going out altogether. The few times he did, he could feel the stares, the whispers. Even the cashier at the corner store avoided small talk now. At night, he lay awake, replaying everything in his head. The charity event, the counting of donations, locking the office door. Had he missed something? Had someone used him? None of it made sense. One evening, Rachel stopped by with new updates. She spread the evidence photos across his kitchen table. The fingerprints, the timestamps, the bank deposit. "Your car was seen near the school," she said. "You sure it wasn't you?" "I swear I was home all night," Daniel said. "I watched a movie and fell asleep on the couch." "Anyone who can confirm that?" He shook his head. "No, I live alone," Rachel sighed. "That makes it harder, but not impossible." She paused, studying one of the photos. It showed a still image from the security camera, the grainy outline of a car parked in front of the school. "Something feels off," she murmured. "Look at the shadows. It's raining here, but there's no reflection under the car. Maybe this was taken earlier that day." Daniel leaned closer, hope flickering for the first time in days. "You think the footage was edited?" "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe we're missing a piece." For the first time since his arrest, Daniel felt a tiny spark of relief. Someone believed in him, not just because she had to, but because she truly wanted to find the truth. Still, as the weeks went on, the world around him grew colder. The school board announced his temporary replacement. Parents protested outside the school, demanding stricter security. Daniel's name became a headline, then a cautionary tale. One night, after another restless evening filled with anxiety, Daniel sat at his desk and began writing a letter to his students. "Dear class, I don't know what you've heard about me, but I want you to remember what I always taught you. Truth doesn't disappear even when people try to bury it. It waits for the right moment to be seen. I hope one day you'll understand that." He didn't send it, but writing it made him feel lighter. Somewhere deep inside, he still believed the truth would come out. It had to. What Daniel didn't know was that a small clue, something barely noticeable, had already started to shift everything. It was hidden in the very footage that seemed to condemn him, a faint reflection caught by accident. It would take time before Rachel noticed it, but when she did, it would turn the entire case upside down. For now, though Daniel waited in silence, a man trapped by lies he couldn't untangle, holding on to one fragile hope, that the world would one day see him for who he truly was. Outside, the rain began again, soft and steady, washing over the quiet streets of Brookhaven. Inside his dimly lit house, Daniel sat by the window, watching the water blur the lights. Somewhere in that rain, he imagined, the truth was trying to find its way back to him. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel felt the weight of time pressing on him. Every morning he woke with the same thought. Maybe someone had realized the mistake, maybe today the truth would come out. But every day ended the same way, with silence. When the trial date was set, he felt both dread and relief. At least it meant something was finally moving. The waiting had become unbearable. His lawyer, Rachel, spent hours with him going over every detail. She told him to stay calm, answer questions honestly, and trust her to handle the rest. He nodded each time, but inside, fear churned like a storm. The courthouse was an old building that smelled faintly of paper and dust. On the first day, Daniel stood at the entrance in his only gray suit, the one he wore for school ceremonies. People stared as he walked through the hall. Some whispered. Others pretended not to see him. It was a small town. Everyone knew everyone. Rachel met him outside the courtroom. "You okay?" she asked quietly. "As okay as I can be," he said. She smiled softly. "Just remember, truth has a way of showing itself even when it's late." Inside, the courtroom was packed. Journalists sat in the back, typing fast as the judge entered. The prosecutor, a tall man named Grant, stood confidently, his files stacked neatly. He looked like someone who'd already made up his mind. The case was presented as simple. Daniel Mercer, a trusted teacher, had stolen from the very children he claimed to care for. They painted him as desperate, someone drowning in quiet debt who found an easy way out. Grant spoke with precision, making every detail sound undeniable. The fingerprints, the video, the bank deposit. As Daniel listened, his stomach twisted. Each word made him feel smaller. He wanted to stand up and shout, "You're wrong!" But Rachel's gentle hand on his arm reminded him to stay still. When it was Rachel's turn, her tone was calm but firm. "My client is innocent. The evidence you've seen doesn't tell the full story. We intend to show that someone else used Mr. Mercer's access and trust to commit this crime." Some people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably, as if they didn't want to believe her. The first witnesses were called, the principal, the school treasurer, and a few teachers. They spoke about Daniel's good record, his years of service, his involvement in charity drives. For a moment it seemed like they might defend him, but then the prosecutor would remind them of the facts. The car, the fingerprints, the money. And slowly, even the kind words lost their strength. By the end of the first week, Daniel could feel the public opinion turning harder against him. Every newspaper headline was the same: teacher's betrayal, beloved educator or hidden thief. At home he avoided reading them. He didn't even turn on the TV anymore. He just sat on the porch with Max, watching the sun go down, wondering how fast a good life could fall apart. One evening, Lily came by with groceries. She sat across from him, her eyes full of worry. "You need to eat," she said softly. He nodded, pushing a plate around without touching it. "They think I'm a monster." "Not everyone," she said. "I don't." Daniel looked at her and tried to smile, but it barely reached his eyes. "Sometimes I wonder if that's enough." Lily reached across the table and took his hand. "It has to be. The truth will come out, Danny. It always does." Her words lingered, but hope was fragile now, a thin thread that could snap any moment. When the second week of trial began, Rachel started digging deeper. She questioned the police investigator about the fingerprints. "Were these prints the only ones found on the safe?" "No," he admitted. "There were several, but the other set belonged to a staff member, the janitor. Eli Turner?" "Yes. Did you investigate him?" "Briefly. His alibi checked out." Rachel tilted her head slightly. "And what was that alibi?" "He said he was at home watching television." Rachel paused for effect. "Alone?" The investigator hesitated. Yes, there was a quiet murmur in the room. The judge called for silence, but the moment had done its work. A few people in the audience exchanged glances. When court adjourned that day, Daniel felt a tiny spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Outside the courthouse, a light drizzle fell. Rachel stood beside him under her umbrella. "That was good," Daniel said. She nodded. "It's a start. But we'll need more than doubt." "We need proof. How do we find that?" She looked up at the gray sky. "By not giving up." The next few days were filled with long hours of review. Rachel went through every second of security footage again, sometimes frame by frame. Daniel sat with her, tired but determined. They watched the grainy black and white images of the hallway, the office door, the safe. It was like reliving the nightmare in slow motion. At first, nothing seemed new. Then one late evening, Rachel leaned closer to the screen. "Wait," she said softly. Daniel squinted. "What?" "Right there. Look at that reflection." On the edge of the frame, in the shiny surface of a trophy case, was a faint shape, not clear but distinct enough to show it wasn't Daniel. The person was shorter, stockier, and wore a jacket with a white stripe down the sleeve. Daniel frowned. "That's not me." "No," Rachel said, her voice quiet but steady. "It isn't." They froze the frame, staring at it like a clue from a dream. "Can you enhance it?" Daniel asked. "I'll get a specialist to do that," Rachel said, already reaching for her phone. "If this is what I think it is, we might just have the break we need." That night, Daniel barely slept. He replayed the image in his mind, the reflection, the jacket, the possibility that someone else had been there. Could it be Eli? He remembered seeing the janitor wear a jacket like that a few times. But he couldn't be sure. The next morning, Rachel called. "The image is clearer now," she said. "And Daniel, it's definitely not you. The person's build is different. The hairline, too. And guess what? I found an old photo from the staff yearbook. Eli wearing the same jacket. Daniel's heart pounded.
Do you think he did it?
I think we finally have a reason to ask more questions. The following day in court, Rachel kept quiet about the discovery. She didn't want to reveal it until she had something solid, but Daniel could see the calm confidence in her face now. The look of someone who had found a loose thread and knew how to pull it. When Eli Turner was called to the stand as a witness, Rachel watched him carefully. He looked nervous, fidgeting with his hands. His voice trembled as he swore to tell the truth. "Mr. Turner," Rachel began, "how long have you worked at Brookhaven High?" 10 years, he said. "You have keys to most of the school, correct?" "Yes, for maintenance." "Were you working the night of the theft?" "No, ma'am. I was home." "Alone?" "Yes." Rachel let the silence hang for a moment. "Mr. Turner, do you own a jacket with a white stripe on the sleeve?" He blinked. I used to, maybe. Why?" Rachel tilted her head slightly, watching his reaction. "Just curious." Eli swallowed hard and looked down. It was a small thing, but Daniel saw it too. That flicker of fear. When court ended, Rachel packed her files and said quietly, "He's hiding something." Daniel nodded. "I could see it," she smiled faintly. "Then maybe, Mr. Mercer, the tide's finally turning." That night, Daniel stood outside his house, breathing in the cold air. The stars were faint behind the clouds, but he felt lighter than he had in months. For the first time since his arrest, he allowed himself to imagine a future again, one where people looked at him with trust instead of suspicion. Inside, Max wagged his tail and pressed against his leg, sensing his master's calmer heart. Daniel knelt and rubbed the dog's head. "We're getting there, buddy," he whispered. "We're getting there." The next morning, Rachel called again, her voice quick and excited. "Daniel, you won't believe this. I got a statement from one of the night security guards. He remembers seeing Eli near the school after hours a few times. Said he didn't think much of it back then." Daniel felt his throat tighten. "So he was there." "It's not proof yet," Rachel said. "But it's a thread. And threads, when you pull them, sometimes unravel everything." Daniel looked out the window at the rising sun. For months he had lived under the shadow of lies. Now for the first time, that shadow seemed to be fading. The truth wasn't just a hope anymore. It was coming closer piece by piece, like light breaking through a storm. Rachel didn't waste any time after that court session. The reflection in the trophy had opened a door she couldn't ignore. She spent the next few days chasing small details that most people would overlook. Key logs, maintenance schedules, and old emails between staff. Daniel met her every morning at the courthouse cafe, both of them tired but holding on to the same fragile hope. The morning air was cold, and Daniel wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "You think we can really prove it was Eli?" he asked. Rachel nodded slowly. "If he's the one who did it, then yes. But we need something more than suspicion or a blurry reflection. We need something solid, something that connects him directly to the money." Daniel sighed. "The truth is there somewhere." "It has to be," Rachel smiled faintly. "And we're going to find it." That afternoon, she met with the school's new accountant, a quiet woman named Janice. She had only been working there for a few months, but she'd already organized the records from the charity fund. As they went through the paperwork, Rachel noticed a pattern. Small amounts of cash listed as maintenance expenses during the same week as the theft. "Who approved these?" Rachel asked. Janice frowned. "These were processed under Eli Turner's maintenance account. But the signatures look strange." Rachel took a closer look. The signature was meant to be Daniel's. It wasn't his handwriting, but someone had tried to imitate it. She felt her pulse quicken. "Could I get copies of these?" Janice nodded. "Of course." When Rachel showed them to Daniel later that day, he stared at the papers in disbelief. "That's not my signature. Look at the M. I never write it like that." "This might be what we need," Rachel said quietly. "If we can show that Eli forged your signature before, it supports everything else." Daniel rubbed his face with his hands. "Why would he do this? What could he possibly gain?" Rachel hesitated before answering. "Maybe money. Maybe revenge. Maybe he thought no one would ever notice." The next morning, they returned to court. Rachel kept her findings close, not ready to show them yet, but ready to use them when the moment came. The trial was reaching its midpoint, and both sides were pushing harder. The prosecution kept repeating the same words. Evidence doesn't lie. But Rachel knew that evidence could be twisted and truth could be buried. During cross-examination, she asked to revisit the footage. The judge allowed it. The lights dimmed and the same grainy video played on the large screen. The jurors leaned forward, watching the blurry image of a figure near the safe. "Mr. Mercer," Rachel said, "is this you?" Daniel shook his head. "No, that's not me." Rachel paused the footage at the exact moment the reflection appeared in the trophy's glass. "Your Honor, I'd like to draw attention to the reflection in this frame. It was missed in the initial review." The prosecutor frowned. "Your Honor, this is speculative. Let her continue," the judge said. Rachel stepped closer to the screen. "We've enhanced this frame. The person in the reflection is shorter and wearing a jacket with a white stripe on the sleeve, not something my client owns. However, another staff member, Eli Turner, has been photographed wearing that same jacket multiple times." A low murmur filled the courtroom. Eli, sitting in the back, shifted uncomfortably. Rachel continued, her tone calm but firm. "Additionally, we've discovered prior maintenance expense records under Mr. Turner's account that were signed with my client's forged signature. These records date back several weeks before the theft." Grant, the prosecutor, rose to object, but the judge allowed the evidence to be admitted for review. That moment changed the tone of the trial. For the first time, doubt crept into the prosecution's case. People in the courtroom began whispering, their certainty shaken. When the session ended, Eli avoided eye contact and left quickly. Daniel watched him go, his heart pounding. "He looked scared," he said quietly. Rachel nodded. "He should be. Truth has a way of making people nervous." Over the next few days, Rachel worked to build on the momentum. She met with a tech specialist who confirmed that the timestamp on the street camera footage showing Daniel's car could have been altered. The footage had a small glitch, a single frame that suggested tampering. When she presented this to the court, Grant's confidence started to waver. He tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, but Rachel's case was gaining strength. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, their questions sharp and eager. "Mr. Mercer, did you know the janitor personally?" one asked. Daniel shook his head. "I worked with him, but I didn't know much about his life. I trusted him, like everyone else." Another reporter asked, "Do you think he framed you?" Daniel hesitated. "I think someone used my trust against me. That's all I know." That night, the story began to change. The same newspapers that once called him a thief now printed headlines like, "New evidence raises questions in charity theft case." It wasn't freedom yet, but it was a small step toward clearing his name. Still, Rachel knew the battle wasn't over. She needed a confession, or something close to it. She decided to pay Eli a visit. It was late afternoon when she knocked on the door of his small apartment. Eli opened it a crack, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Miss Linwood," he said slowly, "what are you doing here?" "I just wanted to talk," Rachel replied, her tone calm. "I'm not here to accuse you. I just need to understand what really happened that night." He hesitated before letting her in. The apartment smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and old coffee. Rachel sat across from him at the kitchen table. "You've worked at that school a long time," she began. "You must have seen a lot of things." Eli nodded, his eyes darting toward the window. "I just do my job." "I believe that," Rachel said. "But you were there that night, weren't you?" His shoulders stiffened. "No, I told you already." "I was home." Rachel slid a photo across the table, the enhanced image from the trophy reflection. "That's you, isn't it?" He stared at it, his face pale. "You can't prove that." Rachel leaned back. "Maybe not yet. But the thing about the truth is it doesn't need to be loud to be real. It just needs to be found." Eli swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly. "You think you know everything," he said quietly. "But you don't." "Then tell me," Rachel said softly. "Help me understand." For a moment he looked like he might speak. His lips parted, his eyes glistening with something that could have been guilt or fear. But then he stood abruptly. "You need to go," he said. "Now." Rachel left without another word, but she knew she was close. Too close for him to stay calm much longer. When she told Daniel what happened, he looked both hopeful and nervous. "You think he'll confess?" "Maybe not right away," Rachel said. "But people like Eli, they crack when the truth closes in. It's just a matter of time." The next day, Eli didn't show up at court. The judge issued a notice for him to appear the following day or face a warrant. Rachel could see what was happening. Guilt was pushing him into a corner. That evening, as Daniel sat alone at home, he looked out the window at the quiet street. The rain had stopped, leaving the world still and damp. He thought about everything he had lost, his job, his reputation, his peace. But now, for the first time in months, he also thought about what he could still gain back. His name, his truth, his life. He whispered to himself, "Please let it end soon." Across town, Eli sat alone in his apartment, the photo of the reflection still on his table. He couldn't stop staring at it. The face might have been blurry, but he knew it was him. Every knock on the door made him flinch. Every passing car made his heart race. The truth was no longer something he could run from. It was right there, staring back at him, waiting for him to admit it. The next morning, the courtroom was tense. Everyone could feel it. Something was about to happen. The air felt heavier, the whispers quieter. Daniel sat at the defense table, his heart beating hard against his ribs. Rachel looked calm, but he could tell she was ready for whatever the day would bring. Eli still hadn't shown up. The judge looked annoyed. "Mr. Turner has been summoned twice," he said, his voice echoing through the room. "If he doesn't appear today, I'll issue a warrant for his arrest." Rachel exchanged a quick glance with Daniel. "He's scared," she whispered. "He's running." Before the judge could move forward, the back door of the courtroom opened. Eli walked in slowly, his face pale, his hands shaking slightly. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept. His lawyer trailed behind him, carrying a small folder. The entire room watched in silence as he took his seat. When his name was called again, he stood and walked to the witness stand. His voice cracked as he swore to tell the truth. Rachel rose from her chair and stepped forward. "Mr. Turner," she began, her tone measured and calm. "Thank you for being here today. I just have a few questions." Eli nodded weakly. "You've worked at Brookhaven High for 10 years, correct?" "Yes." "And you were responsible for maintaining keys to the school building, including the administrative office?" "That's right." Rachel took a step closer. "You told the police you were at home the night the charity funds were stolen. Do you still stand by that statement?" Eli hesitated. "Yes," he said, but his voice was faint. Rachel picked up a sheet of paper. "Mr. Turner, we have bank records showing that 2 weeks before the theft, several cash withdrawals were made from the charity account under false maintenance expenses. Those forms were signed with my client's forged signature. Your name appears on the approval line. Would you like to explain that?" Eli's eyes widened. "I don't know anything about that." Rachel didn't move, didn't blink. "You don't?" She held up the enhanced photograph from the security footage. "Then how do you explain this image? The reflection of a man in a white striped jacket, the same kind you owned, standing beside the school safe the night of the theft?" The courtroom was silent except for the sound of Eli's breathing. His hands trembled slightly. "That's not proof," he muttered. "Maybe not," Rachel said softly. "But you see, Mr. Turner, the truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, and that whisper becomes louder the longer you ignore it." Eli looked down at his hands. A long moment passed. The judge waited. The audience waited. Daniel held his breath, then Eli's shoulders slumped. His voice broke as he spoke. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said quietly. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Rachel didn't speak. She let the silence do the work. Eli swallowed hard. "It was supposed to be simple. I needed money. My mother was sick and I couldn't afford her treatment. I knew about the charity funds and I thought I could borrow it for a while, just until I got back on my feet." His eyes filled with tears. "But then I panicked. I thought they'd trace it to me. I remembered that Daniel had keys. I found his car keys on his desk one night. I drove his car near the school to make it look like it was him. I used his access card to open the door." The entire courtroom froze. Rachel's voice was calm but sharp. "So you admit to stealing the money and framing Mr. Mercer?" Eli nodded slowly, tears streaming down his face. "Yes, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to ruin his life. I just didn't know how to stop." Daniel closed his eyes. For the first time in months, he felt air rush into his lungs like he'd been underwater and had finally surfaced. The prosecutor looked pale, flipping through his notes but finding nothing left to stand on. The judge called for order as the room filled with murmurs. Rachel quietly placed her papers on the table and exhaled. When court resumed, the judge's voice was steady but heavy with emotion. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "you are cleared of all charges. You are free to go." Daniel sat still for a moment as if his body hadn't caught up with his mind. Then Rachel leaned over and whispered, "It's over." He looked at her, tears welling in his eyes. "You believed me when no one else did." She smiled softly. Sometimes believing is the first step to finding the truth. As Daniel stood and faced the crowd, he could feel dozens of eyes on him, some filled with guilt, others with relief. He didn't feel anger, not even toward Eli, just a deep, aching sadness that things had ever come to this. Outside the courthouse, the air was fresh after a morning rain. Reporters surrounded him, microphones flashing, questions flying, but Daniel barely heard them. The only sound that mattered was the quiet rhythm of his own heartbeat, steady and alive. He looked up at the sky, the clouds breaking just enough for sunlight to shine through. For the first time in months, he felt warmth again. Later that afternoon, he walked home. The streets looked the same, yet everything felt different. Neighbors peeked from their windows. Some even stepped out to apologize. He nodded politely but said little. He wasn't looking for sympathy. He just wanted peace. When he reached his porch, Max bounded toward him, tail wagging furiously. Daniel knelt down and hugged the dog tightly. "We did it, boy," he whispered. "We finally made it." Inside, he poured himself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching sunlight dance on the wet pavement. The house felt alive again. Rachel called later that evening. "How are you holding up?" she asked. Daniel smiled faintly. "Free, that's how I'm holding up. You deserve it," she said. "You never stopped fighting." He chuckled softly. "To be honest, I almost did. But you didn't let me." There was a pause, then Rachel said, "The truth has a funny way of finding people who deserve it. You just have to hold on long enough." After the call, Daniel sat in silence for a long time. The day had been a whirlwind of disbelief, relief, tears. But beneath it all was peace. A kind he hadn't felt in months. As night fell, he stepped outside again. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the faint laughter of children, maybe from the park where the charity events used to be held. He thought of the money, the lies, the trial, and then he thought of something simpler. The truth, the one thing that had almost been lost but had found its way back in the end. He closed his eyes, whispering to himself, "No matter how dark it gets, truth doesn't disappear. It just waits." And somewhere, deep in that quiet night, it felt like the world was finally listening. The days after the verdict felt unreal for Daniel. For so long he had lived under a shadow that he almost didn't know how to stand in the sunlight anymore. Every morning he woke up half expecting a knock at the door. Another question, another accusation. But it never came. The nightmare was over. The first thing he did was visit the school. The halls were quiet when he walked in. A few teachers stopped what they were doing and stared, unsure of what to say. Some gave small awkward smiles. Others looked away in shame. He didn't hold it against them. People believed what they saw, and all they had seen was what they were told to believe. When he reached his old classroom, the door creaked the same way it always had. The smell of chalk and paper hit him instantly, bringing back memories of lessons, laughter, and the sound of students' voices. His desk was still there, though covered in a thin layer of dust. On the board, someone had written a note in faint white chalk. "We miss you, Mr. Mercer." He stood there for a long moment, his throat tight. For months, this room had felt lost to him. Now it felt like a part of him was finally coming home. The principal came in quietly. "Daniel," he said, almost hesitant. "I don't have the words to tell you how sorry I am." Daniel turned and smiled faintly. "You don't need to." "I understand," Mr. Harlan sighed. "I should have trusted you." "We all should have." "People see what's in front of them," Daniel said. "Sometimes that's easier than seeing what's real." The principal nodded. "The board has agreed to reinstate you. If you want to come back, the job is yours." Daniel looked around the room again, the empty chairs, the sunlight falling across the desks. "I'd like that," he said softly. When he left the building, the air outside was warm and full of life. The leaves rustled in the trees, and for the first time in a long while, he smiled without forcing it. That weekend, he went to visit his sister. Lily met him at the door and hugged him tightly, tears in her eyes. "It's finally over," she whispered. He hugged her back. "Yeah," he said, "it is." They spent the afternoon in her backyard talking about everything except the case. It felt good to laugh again, to talk about small things. Her garden, Max's constant need for attention, the movie they used to watch as kids. For the first time in months, the conversation didn't circle back to the trial. It was just life, simple and peaceful. Later, as the sun set, Lily asked, "Do you hate him?" "The janitor?" Daniel thought about it. "I did," he said honestly. "At first I hated him for what he did, for stealing my name, my peace, my life. But now I just feel sorry for him. People do desperate things when they're scared. That doesn't make it right, but it makes it human." Lily smiled softly. "That's why you're different, Danny. You never let hate change you." He looked at her and nodded. "I couldn't. If I did, then he'd still be winning." A week later, the town held a small community event, the same kind of charity drive that had once led to everything falling apart. Daniel was nervous about going, but Rachel convinced him. "People need to see you again," she said. "Not the version they read about. You." When he arrived, the crowd turned quiet for a moment. Then a few people came up to him, parents, students, even strangers, shaking his hand, apologizing, thanking him for coming. A little girl tugged at his sleeve and said, "My mom says you're a good man." Daniel smiled, bending down to her level. "Your mom sounds smart," he said, and the girl giggled. Rachel stood off to the side, watching. When Daniel joined her, she smiled. "See? The world remembers kindness longer than it remembers lies." "Maybe," Daniel said, "but I think the truth remembers even longer." They watched the crowd for a while, families laughing, kids playing, the donation box filling up again. It was the same scene that had once led to his downfall, but now it felt like a new beginning. When evening came, Daniel walked home under a sky painted with orange and pink. The town looked different now, not because it had changed, but because he had. The bitterness that had once sat heavy in his chest was gone. In its place was a quiet strength, the kind that comes only after surviving something that should have broken you. He stopped by the park and sat on a bench. Max sat beside him, resting his head on Daniel's leg. For a long while they watched the people walking by, the laughter of children echoing in the air. Daniel thought about everything that had happened, the arrest, the trial, the nights filled with doubt. And he thought about that one truth, the small, almost invisible detail that had changed everything. A reflection in a trophy, a moment no one else saw. He smiled at the thought. It was strange how life worked, how a single truth, no matter how small, could turn the entire world back upright. When the first stars appeared, he whispered softly, "Thank you." He wasn't sure if he was thanking Rachel or Lily, or something higher, maybe all of them. As he stood to leave, he glanced one last time at the horizon. The sky had cleared completely, no clouds left, only the calm after the storm. He walked home slowly, his steps light, his heart steady. When he reached his porch, he looked back at the quiet street, the same one where it had all begun. It no longer felt like the scene of his ruin. It felt like the start of something new. Inside, the house was warm. He made himself a cup of tea and sat by the window again, the same window where he had once watched the rain and wondered if life would ever feel normal. Now it did, maybe even better than before. He looked at the reflection of the room in the glass, in a calm, ordinary, full of light. And he smiled, because he knew that sometimes truth doesn't shout, it whispers. Sometimes it hides in reflections, in patience, in faith. And sometimes it arrives just in time to change everything. Daniel leaned back in his chair, Max sleeping at his feet, and let out a deep breath that felt like the end of something and the start of something new. Outside, the world was quiet, peaceful, and full of promise. A world where one truth had changed the verdict, and with it a man's entire life. Months passed, and life slowly found its rhythm again. Daniel had returned to teaching, though at first it felt strange to stand in front of his students. Some of them had seen the news, and there were quiet whispers at the back of the class. But he didn't mind. He understood curiosity. It was human. Instead of ignoring it, he talked to them one morning. He stood at the front of the room, hands resting lightly on the desk, and said, "You might have heard stories about me. Some of them are true, some aren't. What matters most is what we learn from them." The room went silent. Every student watched him, waiting. He smiled gently. "Sometimes the truth is hidden, and it takes time to find it. But when you do, it sets everything right again. That's what I learned." Don't be afraid of the truth, even if it takes you through hard places to reach it. The students nodded, and from that day on, the whispers stopped. They saw him differently, not as the teacher who had been accused, but as someone who had stood up for what was right. After class, one of the younger students stayed behind. She looked nervous. "Mr. Mercer," she said softly, "my brother got in trouble for something he didn't do. People didn't believe him. But hearing you talk today, it gave me hope." Daniel knelt beside her and smiled. "Tell your brother to keep holding on," he said. "The truth always finds a way." She nodded, her eyes shining, and hurried out. Moments like that reminded Daniel that maybe everything he went through had a purpose. Maybe his story could help someone else believe when they wanted to give up. Outside the classroom, life felt lighter. Rachel had become a close friend, someone he often met for coffee after work. They didn't talk about the trial anymore. They talked about small things, books, music, life. One evening, as they sat at a quiet cafe near the river, she said, "You know, I think what happened to you changed more people than you realize." Daniel looked at her, puzzled. "How do you mean?" "People in this town," she said. "They used to believe what they saw without question. Now they think twice. They've learned that not everything true is loud, and not everything loud is true." He smiled at that. "That's a good thing." "It is," she said. "Because truth isn't just about being right. It's about being real. And you taught them that." For a moment, they just sat there watching the river move slowly under the fading sun. The air was cool, and the water shimmered with streaks of gold. Daniel said quietly, "You know, sometimes I wonder what would have happened if that one detail, that reflection, hadn't been found." Rachel looked at him, her voice soft. "Maybe it still would have found its way out. Truth has a strange way of surviving." He nodded, thinking about that. Maybe she was right. Maybe the truth wasn't something people created. Maybe it was something that always existed, waiting for someone to notice. As autumn came, the town seemed more alive than ever. Daniel's students prepared for their end-of-year performance, and the school invited the whole community to attend. The event took place in the same hall where the charity funds had once gone missing. But this time, the space was filled with laughter, music, and hope. Daniel stood near the stage, helping set up chairs when the principal approached. "You've done a lot for these kids," he said. "And for this town. Thank you for coming back." Daniel smiled. "This was always home. I just had to find my way back." When the program began, he sat in the front row. The students performed their songs, their plays, their dances, and he couldn't stop smiling. For the first time in a long while, the place felt clean again. Like all the darkness that once lived there had been washed away. Halfway through the event, the lights dimmed, and one of his students walked up to the microphone. "This song," she said, "is for someone who taught us that truth matters more than fear." Daniel froze, his heart tightening. The music started, soft piano notes filling the room. The students sang about courage, about standing firm when the world turns against you, about the light that comes after the storm. By the time the song ended, his eyes were wet. He clapped, but his hands trembled slightly. Rachel glanced at him from the back of the room and smiled. A quiet, knowing smile. After the event, people came up to him one after another, thanking him for staying, for forgiving, for reminding them that justice could still mean something real. Later that night, he walked home under a cool sky. The moon was bright and the air was still. The town slept peacefully, unaware of how far he had come since those dark months. When he reached his house, he sat again by the window with Max sleeping beside him. He thought about everything, the lies, the loss, the long wait for truth. And for the first time, he felt grateful even for the hard parts. Because without them, he would never have seen what strength really meant. He whispered softly to himself, "Sometimes one truth changes more than a verdict. It changes the person who finds it." He leaned back, watching the moonlight spill across the floor, and felt completely at peace. The pain was still there somewhere deep inside, but it no longer hurt. It just reminded him that he had survived. That truth had not only freed him, but rebuilt him. Outside, a gentle wind moved through the trees. The world was quiet again, honest again. And Daniel, sitting in his little house with his loyal dog beside him, finally felt what he had been searching for all along. Not victory, not revenge, but peace, and in that silence, it was clear that the truth hadn't just changed a verdict, it had changed everything. Winter came quietly that year. The mornings were misty, the streets dusted with frost, and Daniel found himself enjoying the stillness more than ever before. He would wake early, take Max for a walk through the park, and watch the sun rise through bare branches. The world looked peaceful again, stripped down to the essentials. No noise, no judgment, no fear. Each day felt like a new page. He had begun writing again, something he used to love before everything fell apart. At first the words came slowly, like he had to learn how to trust them again. But soon the sentences flowed and the pages began to fill. He wasn't writing about the trial or the lies. He was writing about people. About truth, about the quiet courage that keeps hearts alive. Sometimes, when he sat by the window with his notebook open, he'd catch his reflection in the glass and calm. Older, maybe a little worn, but at peace. It reminded him of that reflection in the trophy, the one that had saved him. Life had a strange sense of poetry, he thought. What once exposed him to pain had also given him back his freedom. One cold evening, Rachel stopped by unexpectedly. She carried a small box in her hands, wrapped neatly in brown paper. "I was passing by," she said, smiling. "Thought you might like this." Daniel invited her in. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon tea, and Max wagged his tail in excitement at the sight of her. She laughed, kneeling to pet him. "Still loyal as ever," she said. "Always," Daniel replied with a smile. He opened the box carefully. Inside was a small framed photo, a picture of the courtroom taken on the day of his release. He hadn't even known it existed. In it, he was standing beside Rachel, the light from the windows falling across his face. He looked tired, but his eyes were steady. Rachel said softly, "A photographer from the local paper took it. I thought you might want a copy." Daniel looked at it for a long moment. "I don't think I've ever seen myself look more alive," he said. "You look free," she replied. "That's different." He smiled and set the frame on the shelf above the fireplace. "Thank you," he said. "For everything. For believing when no one else did." Rachel shrugged gently. "You didn't need someone to believe in you, Daniel. You just needed someone to remind you that the truth still mattered." They talked for hours after that, about life, forgiveness, and what it meant to start over. When she finally stood to leave, the air outside was sharp with cold. She turned back at the door. "You ever think of leaving this town?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "I used to. Now I think this place needs me as much as I need it." Rachel smiled. "Then I guess the story's not over yet." After she left, Daniel sat in silence for a while, staring at the framed photo. He thought about how far he had come, from being a man accused to being a man who could finally look in the mirror without pain. The truth hadn't just cleared his name. It had taught him who he was when everything else was stripped away. A few weeks later, he was invited to speak at a local gathering, an event for people who had faced injustice and were rebuilding their lives. At first, he hesitated. He didn't think of himself as a speaker or someone with great wisdom. But then he remembered the little girl from his class who had found hope in his words. Maybe, he thought, his story could help someone else the same way. When he stepped onto the small stage that evening, the audience was quiet. The lights were warm and the room felt intimate, like a place where stories belonged. He began simply. "There was a time," he said, "when I thought my life was over. I thought truth had turned its back on me. But I learned something. Truth doesn't disappear. It waits, it watches, and it finds you when you're ready to stand with it again." The room was still, the kind of stillness that comes when people are truly listening. He told them about the months of fear, the trial, the small detail that changed everything. But more than that, he talked about forgiveness, about how freeing himself from bitterness had been the real victory. When he finished, there was no loud applause at first, just quiet respect. Then one by one people stood, clapping gently, sincerely. Daniel bowed his head, humbled. After the event, a man approached him, middle-aged with tired eyes. "I was accused once too," he said quietly. "Different story, same kind of pain. I almost gave up. But hearing you talk, it reminded me to keep going." Daniel shook his hand firmly. "Don't stop. The truth has a long way of finding people who don't give up." That night, walking home under falling snow, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt even at his acquittal. A deep, calm joy. He realized that what had once been his greatest pain had become his purpose. His story wasn't just about being proven innocent. It was about helping others find their way through darkness, too. When he reached home, he lit a small lamp by the window. The snowflakes outside glowed softly in its light. He sat down, notebook in hand, and wrote a single line at the top of the next page. The truth doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be seen.